It's exactly 8:41 a.m. You're with me, Julie Ali, on News and Views. My next guest is Professor Mosa Moshabela, Deputy Vice Chancellor of Research and Innovation, University of KwaZulu-Natal, and the Chair, Committee on Health Academy of Science of South Africa. A very good morning to you. Welcome to the program. And so very nice to be talking with you again.
Good morning, Julie, and to the listeners as well.
Okay, so let me start off with this statement. The COVID-19 infection rate in various parts of South Africa is on the rise as scientists work hard to understand the new Omicron variant. And there is that possibility of introducing mandatory, and I need to add this other word next to that, mandatory / compulsory vaccinations is being discussed by a government task team. Your thoughts, is it a good idea? Are we headed in the right direction?
Yes, just because you also underline compulsory, maybe let me start with the words themselves, right? So we've got mandatory and we've got compulsory. And for me, I think that oftentimes we get caught up in the words, and the words mean different things, generally speaking, to different people. And I find it useful to just unpack what I mean rather than dwell on the words. So mandatory, compulsory, enforced are often used interchangeably. I think that they're not the same. I think of forced as when someone has an injection forced into their arm against their will. I think of compulsory as something that involves being compelled. An example is if someone is involved in a car accident and they've been drinking and they're taken by the police to a doctor to draw blood for alcohol. Sometimes they may not want to do it, but they are compelled by law to do it. They have to consent, but they are compelled. They'll draw blood to test them for alcohol. And I think of mandatory in terms of mandate, not necessarily mandatory in terms of force, the way we use it loosely in society. And mandates here mean mostly around incentives and penalties. If you think about it, we've got non-smoking mandates in South Africa. Most people know this, that there are places where you don't smoke and then you can go outside and smoke. You can have a specific room where you smoke. And these are regulations. You can't smoke in a flight. And these are mandates. And we understand them. It's unfortunate that we don't really, as adults, we're not familiar with vaccines. And we get vaccines when we are young. The only really true mandate that we are familiar with in terms of vaccines is yellow fever, where there are places where you wouldn't be able to arrive without the vaccine. COVID-19 international travel now has moved in that direction. So I would explain mandatory in that way, Julie, in order to create the context for my view that I do support the vaccine mandate.
Okay, we do know that there's been a big pushback, very especially by university students, and I'm kind of wondering why. You in that space, in the tertiary field, maybe you can expand a little more. Also, AfriForum is threatening to take the matter to court. They are outwardly rejecting, never mind compulsory, but they're outwardly rejecting the issue around mandatory vaccinations. They are saying that it is against every person's constitutional right to even talk mandatory vaccinations. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it is a view. It doesn't necessarily make it right. And, in health and in medicine, we deal with two paradigms of ethics. One is biomedical ethics framework, which is about you consenting to treatment as an individual or consenting to an operation. You make that choice. But there are, and that is about matters that affect you as an individual, but there are matters of health that affect other people as well. And that's when we introduce what we call a public health ethics framework. And in the public health ethics framework, it's about how what you do affects other people. In constitutions, we talk of rights and responsibilities. You can think of your individual rights as your rights, but oftentimes we neglect what your responsibilities are towards someone else. The public health framework emphasizes your responsibilities to other people. And so in that framework, we are going to say that if the risk of a health threat if the benefits exceed the risk, then what needs to happen is that we can limit your individual rights for the benefit of all, which means that it becomes a public good and it requires more solidarity. So we cannot necessarily continue to pretend or assume that our individual rights, they trump the rights of others. That's incorrect.
How do you think this is going to play out in terms of mandatory and compulsory? Because we are hearing whisperings from government that there's a possibility that it might become compulsory.
So I think that government is also using the words mandatory and compulsory a bit loosely, which is why I'm saying, let's not get stuck in the words, let's get stuck in what they mean. Right now, my understanding, even from the Director General of Health, is that they are talking about vaccine mandate, not compulsory vaccinate. They're not going to compel people to vaccinate against their will, but they will limit access for people. So you can still choose not to vaccinate, but you may not be able to enter into a movie theater or go to a meeting or conference. And sometimes you may not be able to continue with the same work you're doing, depending on how the private sector responds. And all of these things, Julia, I think they are more about limiting your rights, not necessarily forcing you to vaccinate against your will. And people have to understand that. And I think it's about more the incentives and penalties of choosing not to vaccinate, considering that vaccination is now standard of care. And that's the thing. If you now don't want to vaccinate, then you also have to be accountable and take responsibility and accept the consequences that come with that choice.
My final question, Professor Mosa, is in light of the latest happenings in our country, and of course we know it's being it's all around the world. A lot of other countries are now coming out publicly and stating that a lot of, or they've come across a couple of citizens that have tested positive for this new variant. Do you think that our citizens, very especially anti-vaxxers or people who just are not interested in going for the vaccines, do you think this is going to give them a change of heart and a change of mind and start thinking more positively about their health and well-being, including the rest of the community?
So if you look at the data that we have, Julie, in general, we've got up to about 75 to 80% people willing to test. We've got about, say, and let's just say the adults, right? So we've got about 40% of adults who have accepted the vaccination, which means that amongst the adults, there's another 40% that have not yet accepted the vaccination but are willing. This we call the late majority or the late adopters. These are people that will probably vaccinate at some point, but they need time. Unfortunately, we don't have that luxury of time. And so the pressure might actually help them to tip over into saying yes to vaccination. Whereas you will have another 10%, maximum 15% of people that say we don't want to test, and that 10% may never even test. There's definitely about 5% who may never even test unless if you really, take their arm and force the needle into their arm. For me, I'm not even concerned about that 5-10%. I'm much more interested in the 40% that is willing to vaccinate, but they have questions, they've got doubts, they understand. That's the group that we are interested in. Once we reach about 80% of vaccination coverage, we can even do away with vaccine mandates. Vaccine mandates don't have to be permanent. They are about pushing up our vaccination coverage in the shortest period of time so that there can be greater benefits if most people were vaccinated before the fourth wave, we will know that a lot of people will be spared, the economy will be preserved. But if we go into the fourth wave with fewer people vaccinated, we are going to have another peak in cases, peak in hospitalization, peak in death, and we're going to have to restrict the economy with lockdown. And those are the kind of things that we want to avoid by pushing up vaccination rates. But we're not necessarily going to get into a point where we are forcing the last 5% or 10% to vaccinate, in my view. I don't think that that is necessary.
And as I say, by that point, if we manage to get that 40% that you're talking about vaccinated, then hopefully we will have reached herd immunity. On that note, then, let me say goodbye to you. Thank you indeed for your insights, and till the next time, go well.
Thank you, bye.
That was Professor Mosa Moshabela. The time is exactly 8:51. In a minute or two, we're going to be talking gender-based violence with Anela Mda.
Every 60 seconds.